Hi everyone, this week we are going to cover the topic of externalities and public goods. In the review of competitive markets, we saw that those are two cases where the market equilibrium fails to be Pareto efficient. We are going to go through each of these cases today. First, the disclaimer. I do not legally allow this content to be published without my consent. If I see this content uploaded online, I will take it down and I will report whoever posted it. So the outline for today is going to be to start with externalities, with the definition and a couple of examples. Then I'll talk about why they lead to market failures, and I will illustrate that with a graph. Then I'll talk about a way to solve those externalities in the form of bargaining, and in particular I will talk about the Coase theorem. But after that, overall I will talk about how the externality problem is solved via public regulation. Then I will move on to public goods, a specific type of goods where the market equilibrium will fail to be Pareto efficient. I will go through the definition and a couple of examples. And in particular, I will talk about how to provide a public good efficiently. So let's jump to externalities. An externality is a side effect or a consequence of a market activity, production, or consumption that is not reflected in the price or costs, nor taken into account by the market. So here we are talking about the effect of a transaction or maybe of some production activity on a third party. The third party is not involved in the transaction or in the production activity, yet is going to be affected. We have negative externalities and positive externalities. Negative externalities correspond to external costs. It is a cost that falls on people other than those that pursue the activity or are part of the transaction. For instance, smoking generates negative consumption externality. Smoking affects people around the smoker in the form of secondhand smoking, and people who are affected by secondhand smoking are not being compensated for the inconvenience. They're not being paid by the smoker as an apology for the inconvenience. Pollution is also a kind of negative consumption externality. It affects the quality of the air that everyone, including other people than the driver, will breathe. If a driver consumes gasoline buys gasoline for his car to consume in order to drive around, he is not taking into account the impact of his car consumption on bystanders. Bystanders are not being compensated for the fact that they are breathing a lower quality air due to the activity of the car. Pollution also happens at the production level. Some factories release pollutants and they are not paying anybody for the damages caused. Sometimes it can take the form of a polluted river, or it could be polluted air, or it could be the bad consequences of massive deforestation, and so on. Overfishing is also a type of, consumption externality. The use of a water resource to fish often generates negative externalities because individuals tend to either underestimate or sometimes simply ignore the impact of their activity, catching fish, on the ability of other agents to fish as well. It is a problem called the tragedy of the commons, where individuals use a common resource like a lake, a park, and so on, but use it in a selfish way, and because of that, they do not take into account the impact their activity has on the other's activity. At the end of the day, the land, or in general the natural resource, ends up being overused. Externalities can also be positive. In this case, we talk about an external benefit. A benefit received by people other than those that pursue the activity or are part of the transaction. For instance, gardening. Gardening is a production activity, that generates positive consumption externalities. If you decide to grow a garden, a bunch of nice flowers, then bystanders can enjoy the view, which is going to increase their utility. However, bystanders never paid you or compensated you for the cost of growing the garden or for the fact that they are enjoying the view. People who grow a garden tend to grow a garden for themselves. They want their house to look good. They want to grow a garden for other reasons. But they usually don't grow a garden just to satisfy bystanders' eyes. Vaccination. Vaccination sometimes reduces the probability of getting sick for other people. At least it increases immunity. So if somebody catches a disease, the vaccine will allow them to maybe show no symptoms or maybe to get the disease for a shorter amount of time, which is going to limit the exposure to other people. So people around you will also benefit from you getting a flu shot, for instance. Think about it when you consider getting a flu shot every year. You might be confident in your immune system and think, I don't need a vaccine shot. I'm fine, never got the flu. People around you will benefit from it, however. So you might want to do it just for people around you. It could be your parents, your grandparents, which are more likely to be exposed, to catch it, and more likely to suffer from it. You have to pay for your own vaccines, however. Nobody is paying you for that. You're not being compensated for the increase in well-being for people around you. Education expands knowledge. The consumption of knowledge, when we are learning things in school, for instance, is going to benefit bystanders, at least our extended circle of family and friends. They benefit from our knowledge, although they never paid for it. Imagine a very specific case where you are looking at a medical doctor. The acquisition of this knowledge is going to be rewarded on the market. A doctor is going to be paid as a consequence of his knowledge and his activity, but his family will probably benefit from free consultations, free diagnosis. It is an externality. And his family wouldn't probably not pay him for that. They will just ask him, hey, I've been having this symptom, what's going on? Bee farming is a type of production externality which is positive as well. The activity of pollination by bees who go from flowers to flowers and then go back to the hive has beneficial impacts on nearby flowers and orchards. In fact, there is this saying that if bees disappear from the world, humanity is doomed to be extinct within 5 or 10 years. Apparently, the activities of bees has a tremendous positive effect on our lives. A beekeeper, a bee farmer, if you like, is not being compensated by a farmer who is growing fruits in the neighborhood. However, the one growing fruits is benefiting from the bees through higher yields, through a reduction in his production costs. Externalities cause market failure in the sense that the market equilibrium, if we leave it as is, will not be Pareto efficient. Individuals who consider only their own cost and benefit will tend to engage too much in activities that generate negative externalities. So too many or too much of the bad stuff will be produced, or too much of the bad stuff will be consumed. And on the other hand, too little in activities that generate positive externalities. We won't see enough vaccines being consumed. We won't see enough education being acquired. We won't see enough bees in the neighborhood. This comes from the fact that whoever is engaging in such an activity is only thinking about his well-being or his profit. It doesn't take into account the benefits or the harms he's going to cause on agents around him. So in the presence of externalities, the equilibrium in competitive markets is no longer Pareto efficient. Markets that feature externalities will then have to be corrected or regulated in some way if we want the Pareto efficient outcome to be produced. Let's illustrate this on a graph. Let's take the case of a negative production externality. The left graph shows the socially efficient equilibrium. Now let me explain why. The curves SMC and PMC represent respectively the social marginal cost and the private marginal cost. The private marginal cost is the supply function of the firm producing a good and whose production generates negative externalities. The social marginal cost is the marginal cost of producing that good from society's point of view, taking into account not only the firm itself, but the rest of society as well. The idea is that if the production of this good generates negative externalities, then society is going to have to pay a higher cost, figuratively, if they want to produce the good, than what the firm individually has to pay. The blue curve is called the social marginal benefit. It is a demand curve. The idea is that it takes into account all the marginal utilities. It is some sort of an aggregate demand function. Now, here, because the externality is negative, the social marginal cost is higher than the private marginal cost. The firm maybe only has to pay $2 to produce 1 unit of the good. However, due to the created pollution, if you look at the cost of making this good from society's point of view, you would have to take into account the $2 that the firm has to pay, plus maybe a couple of cents due to the carbon footprint or due to the pollution of the water around or the pollution of the air and so on. Now, the socially efficient equilibrium happens where social marginal curves will cross. So, social marginal cost meets social marginal benefit. They meet at P star Q star, and this is what we call the socially efficient equilibrium, because it takes into account all the costs of producing that good. We are going to oppose this equilibrium and the associated surpluses with the market equilibrium QM-PM. The market equilibrium happens where private agents, supplies and demands are going to meet. Here, there is no externality of consumption, so the private marginal benefit is the same as the social marginal benefit. However, the firm has a different marginal cost of producing the good than society as a whole. So, the marginal cost of the firm, the supply of the firm, will meet the demand at QM-PM. Note that, as mentioned in the previous slide, the market equilibrium here is higher, the market equilibrium quantity is higher than the socially efficient quantity. Agents engage too much in activities that generate negative externalities. Now let's compare the surpluses. On the left, we have this consumer surplus and this producer surplus. On the right, you can see that because the market equilibrium price is lower, the consumer surplus should be higher than the socially efficient equilibrium. And in fact, it is. The blue triangle goes all the way down to PM and all the way to QM. So it includes this blue area and also this purplish triangle, which is why I put a blue plus here to say that it is also part of a positive consumer surplus. Now, it is more interesting to look at the producer surplus here. To look at the producer surplus, I need not only to take the individual producer into account, but also the rest of society, because the rest of society is also affected by that production activity. So, when I look at the surpluses, I will only look at social marginal curves. Okay, which is why I have this producer surplus on the left as well. Now, look at this tiny red triangle here. This tiny red triangle corresponds to a case where the price, the market price, is higher than the price society as a whole is willing to sell the good for. So, it is a positive producer surplus. Remember, this producer surplus also takes into account the firm that produces the good. Now, past this point, what happens is the marginal cost of producing the good is increasing, and now it becomes higher than the market price. It means that from society's point of view, it is more costly to produce this good than the price at which the good is being sold. So from society's point of view, this represents some sort of a loss. Of course, for the producer alone, this is still a profit, because you can see that the cost of producing the good for the private producer is way lower. When you take into account the external cost, the damage, then the cost is way higher. So what's happening is, from that point here all the way to QM, this red triangle represents a negative producer surplus. Which is why I put a minus here in red and here in red. Those surpluses are negative. Now, you can see that two areas overlap. We have, on one hand, in this triangle, we have some consumer surplus, which is higher than the socially efficient equilibrium because they enjoy a higher quantity at a lower unit price. But at the same time, from society's point of view, this surplus here, this producer surplus, is negative. So if you want to look at the net impact, the total surplus, adding consumer and producer surpluses, you're going to get here that these two areas are going to cancel out. So it is the same as looking at this triangle as if it was white. There is one surplus here, which is alone. It is a negative producer surplus. Now let's compare both situations. In both situations, we have the same big triangle here. In the market case, it is bigger for consumers than in the socially efficient case. But in total surplus term, the area is exactly the same. Then these two areas here are cancel out, so we end up with a white, like here. But on the right graph, we have this negative red triangle, which we do not have in the socially efficient equilibrium case. So the difference between the two is going to be that red triangle. This will be the deadweight loss. And you can make the same analysis in the case of a negative consumption externality, like smoking, the case of a positive production externality, like bee farming, or the case of a positive consumption externality, like a vaccine or the consumption of knowledge. Every time there will be a deadweight loss. Don't forget that when looking at surpluses here, we are looking at social marginal curves because they take both the private marginal curves and the rest of society's utilities or costs. Any questions about this graph? Okay. So, there will be two subcases for positive externalities. A consumption externality if the social marginal benefit is bigger than the private marginal benefit. So if you get a flu shot, you will get some utility from it. But the utility of people around you will also increase. So when you add your utility plus the utility of everybody else, it will be bigger than just your utility. If it's a production externality, this will be reflected in a decrease in the costs that the rest of society is going to incur. If you're a beekeeper, you have your own cost of raising and keeping bees, but thanks to your activity, other firms might benefit from a lower marginal cost. In particular, firms which are in charge of growing gardens, flower gardens, and fruit orchards. Adding your cost and their cost will result in a lower social marginal cost. If we have negative externalities, we have two subcases. A consumption externality when the social marginal benefit is lower. If you're a smoker, you get some utility from smoking, but if you add all the inconvenience that bystanders will experience, then the social marginal benefit will be lower than the private marginal benefit. And a production externality if the social marginal cost is higher than the private marginal cost. For instance, producing food that uses palm oil generates negative externalities because typically the culture of palm trees is done through massive deforestation of the Amazon, which endangers some animal species, which reduces the quality of the soil because of monoculture, and so on and so forth. Of course, it's not, here I'm talking about the bad kind of production of palm oil. If you're producing palm oil in your garden, then there are no bad externalities. Here I am talking about the implications of growing palm oil at an industry level, which includes deforestation and so on and so forth. Now, how can we solve the problem of externalities? How can we make sure that the market on its own will be able to reach a Pareto efficient allocation? Bargaining could be a way. Forgot to put an example here, I'll put it later. But as an example, imagine that you and your roommate are living together and your roommate is a smoker. when your roommate smokes, even if he or she smokes outside, that might be a smell that comes inside, and that's something that creates an inconvenience to you. You get some disutility when your roommate is smoking cigarettes. Depending on what the rule in the apartment is, you might be able to bargain so that less smoking will be done at the new equilibrium. Note that I'm not saying zero smoking, because your roommate is going to derive some utility from smoking. But at the same time, you derive some disutility. So there should be a sweet spot where everybody is relatively happy and total surplus will be maximized. Imagine that you are the owner of the place, or at least the rule at the place is smoking is not allowed. Your roommate has to go outside, leave the condo, leave the building if he wants to smoke. No externalities for you there. When he comes back, no problem. But maybe your roommate who lives, maybe you guys live on the 30th floor, maybe he wants to smoke, to be able to smoke at the window in your apartment. So he might ask you, hey, I know it's smoking free here, but would you allow me to smoke if I compensate you? If I pay you a couple dollars per cigarette? Can I smoke at the window at least? Then you would get compensated for the inconvenience that he creates when he smokes. Since there would be a price he would have to pay to smoke, he would not smoke an infinite amount either. He would probably smoke less than if he didn't have to pay you. So you can see that by paying you, on one hand, you get compensated, so your utility will maybe increase, probably increase. On the other hand, because now smoking will come at a cost to your roommate, an extra cost, not just the cost of buying the cigarettes, then he might decide to smoke less. Imagine the cost is $2 per cigarette. And if he was free to smoke, he would smoke 1 pack of cigarettes a day, 20 cigarettes a day. It means that you would make $20 a day. Not only you would have to pay $12, $13 for a pack of cigarettes, but he would also have to pay $20 extra for you to allow him to smoke. You can see that he would probably lower his consumption of cigarettes. Imagine, on the other hand, that it is possible to smoke in the apartment, so he can smoke if he wants to. Now you are the one who has an inconvenience, who has a disutility, so you might bargain with your roommate and say, hey, if I give you some money, can you smoke less? For each cigarette I don't want you to smoke, I'll give you $1 or $2. Then there's going to be a price that you will be willing to pay. Of course, you might not be willing to pay $20 a day for him to not smoke at all, but maybe you're willing to pay $2 or $3 a day so that he smokes a bit less, and so the smell is not that bad for you. This led to the Coase theorem. Ronald Coase is an economist who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1991, in particular for this contribution. He stated that people can arrive at an efficient solution to the problem of externalities by negotiating the purchase and the sale of the right to engage in the activities that cause the externality. Typically, you can negotiate with your roommate, depending on who makes the rules. You can negotiate either him paying you to smoke more, or you paying him so he smokes less. The theorem comes with a certain number of conditions, and it has appealing properties. One of them is the efficient solution, the Pareto efficient equilibrium, may not depend on who has the property rights. Whether your apartment is smoke-free or not, whether you're the one making the rules or whether he is the one making the rules, may not depend. What's interesting about this is that it doesn't matter then what the rule is, bargaining can lead you to the same efficient amount. If the efficient amount of cigarettes to smoke in your apartment happens to be 5 cigarettes a day, then either he can smoke as much as he wants and you compensate him, and the equilibrium will get you, the new equilibrium will be the efficient equilibrium. Or the other way around. If he's not allowed to smoke and he pays you to be able to smoke a bit, then he will pay you until he can smoke the efficient amount of cigarettes. It is a consequence of adding utilities together and taking into account the disutility of one because of secondhand smoking and the utility of the other from smoking. Now, if it doesn't matter who makes the rules, what is going to matter? Well, who makes the rules is going to matter is regarding who benefits and who pays. If you are the one in charge and the place is smoke-free, then your roommate is going to pay you and you are going to benefit from it. If on the other hand, smoking is allowed and you're the one who's going to pay your roommate to smoke less, then you're going to pay and he's going to benefit. So the distribution of benefits and costs, who pays whom pretty much, who compensates whom, will depend in the first place on who has the property rights, on who makes the rules. Bargaining is an appealing process, but you can imagine that it can only work for so many people at the same time. If you buy gasoline for your car, how are you expected to bargain or to compensate everybody around you as you drive? Do you need to give 1 or 2 cents to literally each bystander? It would be impossible to implement. So bargaining is a good solution when it involves a small number of agents, like roommates. 3-4 people, maybe a bit more, to have multilateral bargaining. But beyond that, it will be very complicated. You cannot expect to solve the externality problem on a market, on a whole industry, through bargaining. There are many firms, there are many customers, they produce at different places. How do you expect to coordinate all that? Moreover, cohesion bargaining is not always feasible or practical because of other reasons. First of all, there are transaction costs. That represents the total cost of making a transaction. That's planning, bargaining. The process of bargaining itself is painful for people and it involves a lower utility. Deciding, resolving disputes if you need to hire a third party, enforcing, making sure that your roommate is going to smoke the amount of cigarettes he's supposed to smoke and not more, and so on. There could be missing property rights. There is no clear rule on what people can do. If private parties cannot get to an efficient solution, public authorities can step in. In fact, for bigger industries and markets, this is what they will do. And they have different ways to implement regulation. Remedies include Pigovian taxes and subsidies. Arthur Pigou was a British economist who was in particular the supervisor of Keynes. He devised a tax or subsidy system with the goal of restoring the socially efficient equilibrium. So, a Pigovian tax consists in taxing a good that generates negative externalities or subsidizing a good that generates positive externalities. The tax or the subsidy should be equal to the difference between the private and the social benefit or costs at the socially efficient quantity. And I will show you this in a graph in a minute. If you want to limit the production or the consumption of goods that generate negative externalities, you could also think about quotas. You could set a limit on the amount of gasoline that people can consume. It is a bit harder to impose a minimum amount of goods to produce or consume to customers and firms, But for instance, in the case of vaccines, you could make vaccines somehow mandatory. That would ensure that the quota of vaccines is being met. A third, more recent measure is tradable permits and auctions. The idea is to give firms a certain amount of carbon dioxide, for instance, they can emit in the production process. So you can allow them to pollute a certain amount every year. If they pollute less than what they are allowed to, they can sell these extra spare units to another firm who might want to pollute more. So the idea is to put a price on pollution emissions by allowing firms to trade for the right to pollute more, and for some firms to just increase their profits by selling those extra units. The other side effect of that is it gives incentives to firms to produce with a green technology, to adopt a greener technology, yeah. This way, they won't need to pollute as much, and they can sell the spare units to other firms who want to pollute more. This way, there is a market for pollution units. It puts a price on pollution, which should, or at least, should help restore the socially efficient equilibrium. Now, I want to go back to the case of Pigovian taxes with the case of a negative production externality again. So we have our social marginal benefit. We have our private marginal cost. And we have a social marginal cost which is not parallel to the private marginal cost. The idea is that the more you produce, the higher the marginal cost of producing an extra unit. The more you produce, for instance, the more pollution it creates. In the sense that producing the 10th unit of the good pollutes more than producing the first unit of the good. The socially efficient equilibrium is at P star Q star. Now, the idea of the Pigovian tax is to tax producers because they generate the negative externality. You tax them for each unit an amount equal to the difference between social marginal cost and private marginal cost at Q star. And the at Q star is important because note that this gap here is different from this gap here, which is different from this gap here. By taxing exactly by this amount, the private marginal cost curve of the firm is going to shift upwards because now for each unit of the good the firm wants to produce, it has to pay an additional tax T to the government. So the private marginal cost curve will shift to this orange curve that I called PMC plus T, plus tax. And you can see that now, if you leave the market equilibrium do its own thing, then the new private marginal cost curve is going to cross the social marginal benefit at Q star. Now that they meet here, the market equilibrium is Q star P star, so it is back to being Pareto efficient. In real life, there will be difficulties to implement because first you need to know what is Q star P star, what is PMQM. PMQM is what you observe pretty much. This is the quantity of a certain good being sold every day, every month, every year. But how much should be produced is harder because you need to estimate a social marginal cost curve. You need to know not only the private marginal cost curve, but also you need to estimate the external damage caused by the production of the good. The carbon tax is a tax imposed on consumers on each per barrel or per liter of gasoline, which aims at reduce the consumption of gasoline to get closer to the socially efficient quantity. Carbon tax is such an example. It is a certain amount of money, something like a couple cents per liter of gasoline, and it changes across types of gasoline, according to how much they pollute. Any questions about Pigovian taxes? The same way you tax activities that generate negative externalities, you would subsidize activities that generate good externalities so that the equilibrium quantity increases. You would, for instance, subsidize a beekeeper so that it reduces the cost of raising bees, and the beekeeper would decide to increase the scale of his production. The same way, you could subsidize vaccines. The vaccine for coronavirus is free. The vaccine for other diseases like hepatitis B, there's one called HPV, I forgot what it stands for, tetanus, the flu, I believe you have to pay for these. But a way to increase their consumption would be to subsidize the purchase. You go to the store and the store says, nope, yep, every time we administer one vaccine dose, the government is paying us, so you don't have to pay anything. Just get in and get your shot. It is one of the reasons why education is subsidized. In many countries, many programs, public or private, propose funding options for students who have maybe a very good academic record, but maybe are lacking the financial means to go to university. In France, education is free for people who don't have enough income to pay for. For those who have enough income to pay for it, it is still heavily subsidized. Any public French university, well, the university is public in France, charges the same tuition fees, and tuition fees amount to, I believe, $200 a year until you're 20, and after you're 20, $500 a year, 500 euros a year. Any questions? Okay, so let me spend the last 5 minutes on public goods. Public goods are a special case of externality where everybody consumes the same amount. Those goods are characterized by two features. They are non-rival. In this case, it means that the good can be consumed by many people simultaneously, or the use by one individual does not reduce the availability to others. A public good is also non-excludable. It is impossible to exclude somebody from its use. A pure public good is going to be a good that features both of these characteristics. A couple of examples. National defense. In principle, everybody benefits from national defense the same way. If you are on the territory, you will benefit from the same protection as your neighbors. Fireworks. Whether there is one person watching fireworks or 1,000, it doesn't change people's experience of the fireworks. Nature in parks. Whether there is one person or 100 in general, doesn't really change people's experience of the park. Note that it can become rival eventually if the park gets too crowded. If everybody is in the water having fun, then it might be hard to add one extra person without reducing the fun that everybody experiences in the water. But that's an extreme case where we can reach capacity. Until then, people will equally enjoy the park, whether they are alone or whether there are other people around. Rural highways. Why rural? Because they are in general not congested. Those highways are not congested, and one extra car on the highway will not reduce the use of other cars. But on the other hand, if you go to Los Angeles, for instance, traffic congestion is a daily grind there. One extra car is going to make an impact. Inventions, in the sense of ideas, are also public goods. Once the idea is released, everybody can enjoy that idea, or at least learn about it, and consume that idea. Lighthouses. As silly as it sounds, whether you have one boat or 100, they can equally enjoy and use the lighthouse to guide themselves to the harbor. An extreme case where a lighthouse will not be a public good anymore is a case where eventually its use becomes rival. That would be a case where all the waters around the lighthouse would become too congested by boats. Or if maybe a lighthouse is only located in an area with a very narrow stream of water. So only a couple boats can enjoy the lighthouse at the same time. Here is a table that lists different types of goods regarding their characteristics. So let's start with a public good. Non-excludable and non-rivalrous will give you pure public goods. I mentioned national defense and lighthouse, but air is a public good. Nobody can be excluded from breathing air right now. And one extra person breathing air does not have any impact on my breathing. Now, a good which is both rivalrous and excludable would be a pure private good. This is what we buy every day. Food. If you buy yourself a coffee, it is not a public good for everybody to drink from. It is for you. Clothing as well. If a good is non-rivalrous, so one extra user will not threaten the experience of other users, but it is excludable, we are talking about the club goods. You need to pay a membership to have access to it. Satellite television, the internet, Wi-Fi. Well, for Wi-Fi, I guess you need some sort of phone that can get Wi-Fi. Private parks of any sorts. Cinemas. Once you're inside, after paying for your ticket, whether there is one person in the room or all the seats are filled, in principle, will not affect your experience of the movie, unless somebody's noisy. If a good is non-excludable, so you cannot exclude somebody from using it, but it's rivalrous, we are talking about common pool resources. I talked about the tragedy of the commons before. That's a case where you're free to fish in a lake, but as you fish, you reduce the availability of fish to others. So, some people might decide not to come to that lake because they know that there are already many people fishing. So that will make their fishing harder. Same as timber, coal. You're free to go to the forest and gather some woods if you want. But if you start deforesting, then it's going to be harder for other people to have access to extra woods. Of course, here we are talking about big stocks. If you fish in the Fraser River, then before you reach the point where it's highly rivalrous, there's going to be a lot of activity going on. There are so many forests in Canada. Before you reach the point where it becomes very difficult for somebody else to to chop some wood, there's gonna have to be a lot of activity first. Now, how to provide a public good? Why would you on your own pay for public good when you know that everybody else is going to enjoy it equally? It might seem unfair. You're the one paying for it, and other people are going to enjoy it for free. So, providing a public good through private provisions will usually lead to under-provision. Not enough contributions will be made because of the free rider problem. If I expect and I know that other people are going to contribute, then I will reduce my contribution and enjoy the good as well. If everybody is thinking this way though, then eventually all the contributions will be too small. And so not enough of the public good will be provided. In short, agents don't take into account the effect their contribution has on the well-being of others. So it is a positive externality. They do not internalize it, they do not think about it, and because of that, they provide too little effort. If you guys are more interested in that, you could look at some game theory applications on Wikipedia, for instance. Another example of free riding problem is if you have a project with another classmate for a course. Both of you have to work, you have to make a project, a presentation, and you might decide, okay, I'm going to do this part, you're going to do this part. But maybe at home, one of you guys might decide, oh, well, I know the other one is going to work hard, so I don't need to work as hard. He's going to free ride on your work and enjoy the same grade. Not enough of the public good will be provided with private provision, unless specific cases where agents are altruistic. Their utility contains other agents' wealth or utility. So when they maximize their utility, they are including your utility as part of their maximization problem. In this case, they will be happy to do more than what they need. Another problem with the provision of public good based on private contributions is that if you ask people's willingness to pay for public good, they will never report how much they are actually willing to pay. They will report less. It's like a firm asking their customers how much they're willing to pay for this good. A customer doesn't have an incentive to report exactly how much he's willing to pay. He's going to report something lower so that maybe he can benefit from a lower price. And this is one of the reasons the city of Vancouver buys the fireworks on Canada Day. If it was based on voluntary contributions, chances are not enough contributions would be gathered, and the fireworks would last 10 minutes instead of 20 minutes. It is also one of the reasons that justifies taxation. Governments tax because they also want to provide public goods, because if they let people privately contribute, then not enough, in the sense of a not Pareto efficient amount, will be provided. That's it for this lecture on externalities and public goods. Have a good rest of your week, and see you in the next one. Bye.